Hey, good afternoon and welcome to the September Living with Disability Research Centre seminar. This afternoon we have two presentations about supporting participation of people with intellectual disabilities in community and in their own lives. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting at the moment, which is at the Bundoora campus of La Trobe University. The traditional owners are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. If you haven't been to the seminar before, we will have time for questions and answers. If you've got a comment or question you want to ask, please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll moderate those when each speaker has finished. And there will be the slides and the recording of the session will be available on our website in about a week. So our first speaker this afternoon is Associate Professor Ilan Wiesel from the University of Melbourne, from the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, which is always a mouthful. But many of you will be familiar with Ilan. He's been a long-term collaborator of a number of us at the Living with Disability Research Centre. And he's going to continue on his theme about inclusion and belonging for people with intellectual disabilities. And this afternoon is going to talk about libraries as places of belonging and exclusion. So over to you, Ilan. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks everyone for being here. I would also like to echo Chris and join the acknowledgement of country. And I also live and work in the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So my presentation today is about libraries as places of exclusion and belonging. And before I start to talk about libraries, I'll just use La Trobe University and Bundoora campus as an example, just to try to, I guess, provoke us all to think about what it means to think about inclusion and exclusion and belonging or non-belonging through the lens of place. So try to think, we thought about La Trobe University. What does it mean to make La Trobe University more inclusive of people with disability? Versus what does it mean to make Bundoora campus more inclusive of people with disability? So the first is an institution, La Trobe University, and the second is a place, the campus as a place. And you can see these two things overlap, but even just kind of intuitively to think about them, they're not the same things. The university is more than the campus is also more than the institution, more than the university. So I'm a geographer. One of the things we do in geography is to think about place and to think about what it means to think of those kinds of concepts like inclusion and exclusion, belonging and non-belonging through place. So my presentation today has two parts. The first one will be quite theoretical, conceptual. I'll talk about place. I'll talk a bit about inclusion and belonging as concepts, and I'll also talk about place. And I'll introduce you to some geographical thinking and theorizing of place. It's quite a long section, so bear with me with the theoretical part. But then I'll move on to talk about public libraries. And this is part of a bigger study that we did with Chris and other collaborators about the disability inclusive city, where we were looking at a variety of mainstream services in the cities, services and spaces and places. But in this presentation, I'll focus on public libraries. I think it's one of the most, I do think it's one of the most inclusive spaces in contemporary cities. And I also think it's a place that has really transformed over the last 30 years to become so inclusive. And in some ways, I find it quite inspiring to think about how we can think about other places in our society, in our cities, as potentially transforming in a much more radical way than we often think about just adjustments to make places more inclusive. I'm conscious of my voice. I've been teaching today for about 3 hours, so I just hope my voice will last until the end of the presentation, and apologies if I'll take a few breaks for drinking some water. So let's talk about inclusion and place from a more conceptual perspective. Inclusion, as I'm sure you all know, is the key term that guides disability policy these days in Australia and globally. It's the goal around which many of our policies are framed in disability policies, and many of our studies and literature is also framed around inclusion. It became such a popular term around the late 1990s, often attributed to Tony Blair and the New Labour in the UK. They had quite a strong inclusion agenda as part of their third wave politics. Part of it was inspired by sociologist Anthony Giddens. But other countries followed the UK in adopting this inclusion agenda. And I think disability studies, disability policy was particularly enthusiastic in adopting inclusion as its primary objective since the 1990s. And that initial enthusiasm quite quickly also became, inclusion also became a target of critique. And critics argued that, well, some of the criticism was that inclusion still had quite a strong focus on participation in the labour force as the one pathway to inclusion, which perpetuated the exclusion of many people, especially people with intellectual disabilities and profound intellectual disabilities that were excluded from the labour market and did not have a very realistic pathway into the labour market. So that was one criticism. The other concern was that the focus was on building individual capacity for people with intellectual disability to participate in the mainstream, rather than really driving significant structural change in the mainstream settings themselves to make them more inclusive of people with intellectual disability. And I guess some of the critiques of inclusion have come from this idea of belonging as an alternative way to think, an alternative to inclusion. So scholars like Ed Hall, who's a geographer like myself, and in Australia, Eva Stornova, and others, they propose belonging as an alternative way to think about inclusion. Rather than push people to seek to integrate in an exclusionary mainstream, here the emphasis was on finding spaces where people with intellectual disability experience a subjective sense of belonging, even if these spaces are not necessarily mainstream, and even if belonging is primarily within a group of other people with disabilities rather than more diverse people with and without disabilities. I guess to just position myself within these debates, from my perspective, belonging is a very important aspect of inclusion, and it's a condition for inclusion. There is no inclusion without belonging from my perspective. But I also think there's other aspects of inclusion that go beyond subjective sense of belonging. So kind of, I think about belonging as a necessary condition for inclusion, but insufficient. Inclusion is more than that from my perspective. And I guess in geography, and there's a small group of geographers who work within disability studies, especially in the UK, but some in Canada, in Australia, and a few other countries. And we try to tackle those questions of inclusion and exclusion, belonging, non-belonging through the lens of place. So the kinds of questions that we ask in our work is to think about what kinds of places can be accessed by people with different abilities and different disabilities. What kinds of abilities do people gain or lose in different types of places? What does meaningful participation even mean in different types of places? So those are the sorts of questions that geographers ask using place as the lens to think about inclusion. But what is place? That's a big question in itself. So I guess one of the way that to think about place is first to distinguish between space and place. So one of the way that we do that is to say that place is a space, but one that people attach meaning to, and some form of emotional attachment as well. So space is an abstract set of relations, like it's defined by almost mathematical sort of conditions such as distance, proximity, scale. These are the kind of spatial terms. But place is about meaning. It emerges from those spatial relations, but it only occurs once people attach a meaning to a particular space. So once we call a particular space a library, then we've already attached meaning to it, and we've turned it from an abstract space into a place. Place isn't defined by any scale. It could be as small or as big as you wish. It could be your body can be a place. Think of a mother's body who is a place of refuge for her baby. Or some people talk about the whole planet as a place, sorry. So we don't necessarily limit ourselves to any particular scale. I will talk about libraries as a place, but some other writers will talk about the toilets in the library as a place, and that's still legitimate. It's a very fluid concept in that sense. Doreen Massey is a well-known geographer who is considered one of the most important theorists of place. And she really emphasized place is not a bounded area. It's rather, that's a quote, it's a particular constellation of social relations meeting and weaving together at a particular locus. So Massey defined place as articulated moments in networks of social relations and understandings. And I know it sounds very abstract and complex, but think of a map where place is represented as a bounded static area, and contrast that with an image of a network of relationships. So the way that Massey thinks of place is that network rather than this bounded place. Place is a node in this network, and the node and the network are constantly changing. Nothing is static there. Another term that Massey introduced, which I'll come back to today, is thrown togetherness. Place as a thrown togetherness. I love this term. It's the idea that we're all here. Think about this Zoom meeting as a place. It's a virtual place, but it's a place nonetheless. We've all come here. We've all been thrown together in this Zoom meeting. We've come from different places. We moved through different trajectories, but we've been thrown together here in this moment, in this place. So this Zoom meeting is our thrown togetherness. Partly it's random why we're here, partly it's driven by other not so random kind of structural issues. But once we're all thrown together in a place, something new is created. I'll talk about encounters as that something new that is created where people are thrown together in place. There are different elements that make up places. So I'll go through some of those elements and then I'll move on to talk about libraries. So I've sort of developed this framework to think about the different elements that make up a place. And I'll go through each of those in turn very briefly. But I guess I just want to make the point here that I don't think there's any particular order or hierarchy here. I think they're all interconnected and related. So I wouldn't claim that's a comprehensive list. I'm sure others will come up with additional elements, but we can start with these, and then you'll see how I use these elements of place to think about libraries and inclusion and exclusion in libraries. I'll start with materialities. This is one of the first elements of place. Materiality is concerned with how physical materials and forms or designs interact with bodies, human bodies, but also non-human bodies. The materiality of place includes all those physical elements of a place that we can sense with our body, with our senses. Of course, for people with physical disabilities, there's an obvious connection in terms of material barriers that block movement. So we talk about physical accessibility, and that's all to do with materialities. But it's also very relevant to inclusion and exclusion of people with intellectual disabilities, because the materiality of a place embodies and projects symbolic and normative values. It signals particular social hierarchies. It signals to people whether they belong or whether they don't. I'll say more about social norms and places in just a couple of slides. The other thing about materialities is they tend to stick around. Once you design, you build an institution, the brick and mortar, the materiality of it can last for a very long time. And that sort of stickiness of materialities is quite important when you think about change and trying to adjust places. So materiality is about those kind of physical elements, but there's also something a bit more mysterious, I would say. These are atmospheres that exist in places. We know it exists, we can feel it. It's very hard to define atmospheres, but it is a real thing. Geographers are fascinated by place atmospheres, especially in cultural geography. A place atmosphere is something that emanates from both physical materiality, but also immaterial things. So the material things could be things like color, smell, sound of a place. That's the materiality. But it also connects to other kind of non-material things like human behavior. If you hear silence or you hear laughter, that also shapes the atmosphere. So all these things together create an atmosphere in a place. The atmosphere is something that is both objective, it actually exists in space, but it's also subjective, something that different people might experience differently, depending on our positioning, depending on how much we attune to even pay attention to the atmosphere. It's very fluid, it's not something static, it changes, it's like a mood that could change any minute. But there's some more stable elements in place, like the lighting in this photo, that might reproduce certain atmospheres. And what I want to argue is that atmospheres are actually really important when you think about whether a place is inclusive or exclusionary. Certain atmospheres invite certain people, other atmospheres deter or alienate people or other people. Some atmospheres encourage social interaction and conviviality, and other atmospheres discourage that. And when different people experience a shared sense of an atmosphere, when you go to a place and lots of people kind of can feel the atmospheres, that's actually a moment of connection and conviviality and belonging. Attachment, place attachment concerns the emotional attachments that people have in relation to a place. In particular, feeling a sense of belonging in place, a sense of ownership of place, and I mean that in an emotional rather than a legal sense, not legal ownership, but emotional ownership, and a sense of feeling at home in a place. They're all forms of place attachment. And all of these relate very closely to questions of inclusion and exclusion, as I spoke about earlier. Memory plays a really big role in creating, sustaining place attachment. For people with disability, memories of exclusion from a place or discrimination, violence that they've experienced in a place or discomfort that they've experienced can undermine their sense of belonging, and vice versa. Positive memories create a sense of attachment, even in places that for an outside person might seem as very exclusionary place, but for someone can be actually a very strong sense of attachment because of memories. So we do know from the research that many people with intellectual disability sort of gravitate towards places where there are other people with intellectual disability. And initially a lot of it is because of structural reasons. That's just decision made by parents, by support workers, systematic issues. But once people have kind of been in a place for a while, they do build strong attachment to those places. So from an outsider, they might seem as places of exclusion, but for the people in those places, they might see it as a place of belonging through their personal emotional attachments. So again, this is this sort of contradiction sometimes between belonging and inclusion. And as I said, I see those two things are interconnected, not the same, but connected, overlapping, but not identical. Norms are, imperatives that drive our actions. Don't steal, dress appropriately, be polite. And places both reflect societal norms, but they also reproduce them. They help reproduce those norms. And at the same time, different places have their own very localized, very specific place-based norms. In the museum, you have to behave in a particular way, be quiet. Or in the beach, you can walk semi-naked, but you can't do that on campus. So different places have their different norms, but they all relate in all kinds of ways, both align or transgress wider societal norms in quite complex ways, which makes place as a very interesting lens to think about inclusion and belonging. And we know that people with intellectual disability, when they struggle, they're unable to comply with the formal and informal norms of mainstream places. They are marked out of place, and that's part of their exclusion. So remember Doreen Massey, who I mentioned about thrown togetherness and how people and things are thrown together into one place. That creates its kind of social effects that could happen through fleeting encounters where strangers just are thrown together in a place. And Chris Bigby and I, we've done a lot of research on those kinds of encounters that happen when strangers are kind of randomly meet one another. And sometimes these everyday encounters become moments where a person might feel included, and that could happen through very subtle gestures of recognition, welcome, just being treated with dignity and respect by others. Just tiny moments, but each of them on their own might seem insignificant, but they accumulate, and their cumulative effect is really significant when you think about people's lives and their overall sense of inclusion and exclusion. There's also more than just random encounters that happen in place. A place can bring people together in more enduring ways, such as neighbors who live side by side for many years, or members of the gym or even the library, which we'll talk about today, who come to the place for years and see one another on almost a daily basis. So they're no longer complete strangers, and sharing a place really forces people to develop some kind of coexistence. And sometimes, not always, sometimes that coexistence turns into solidarity, where people are actually willing to support one another, and they share a sense of identity and share a sense of connection just from coming from the same place, being in the same place. Sometimes we see in disability studies, we sometimes see those solidarities excluding people with disability, excluding people with intellectual disability. So that, in fact, they turn against people with disability. Brendan Gleeson, who I've worked with, and as part of the study that I spoke about, published a lot about NIMBY campaigns against group homes for people with intellectual disability. So that's an example of local residents creating coalitions and solidarities against the inclusion of people with disability. So it could work both ways as a form of inclusion, but also as a form of, or as a mechanism of exclusion. Places are governed and shaped by organizations and institutions. No single institution ever fully controls any one place, but it can be very powerful actors in shaping how how places are, developed, and how they're constructed, and how people experience places as places of inclusion or exclusion. And I'll talk a bit today about mainstream institutions, specialist institutions, as one way to think about how different kind of organizations shape places, but also talk about state versus private and civic organizations as another way to think about how different institutions produce different types of places. Excuse me for a second there. So this is my final theoretical slide. Thanks for bearing with me. Finally, places are situated in what Doreen Massey described as geometries of power. And that's to say that different places are situated differently in relation to global flows and interconnections. And therefore, they have different forms of power in a sort of global sense, but also national and local sense. That's to say that, if you live in Melbourne or in Delhi or some other place, you'll experience very different experiences, shaped not just by local policies and processes, but also by the location of these places in wider geometries of power. And I'll come back to that in relation to libraries as places that connect people to these global networks. So I guess you can see place is a very complex, multifaceted concept. It's sort of breaking it down to the elements of materialities, atmospheres, attachments, norms, encounters, solidarities, institutions, power geometries. That helps make sense of place and the kind of processes of inclusion and exclusion that happen in places. So I'm moving out now to the next part of the presentation, where I'll try to apply this framework to think about libraries. There's a small but not insignificant body of literature about libraries and people with disability, and about libraries more generally. These studies, what they highlight is that libraries have changed a lot in the last 30 years. I'll talk about that in a minute. They also talk about, the studies talk about what we call the uneven development of libraries, the fact that public libraries are contracting in some countries like the UK under austerity policies. But in Australia, we're seeing growth of libraries and they're really flourishing in Australia right now. And this kind of body of literature offers really useful insights about what is it about libraries that makes them more inclusive or less inclusive. What I hope to offer in this presentation is to take a slightly more holistic approach to think about libraries through the lens of place and the elements of place, which I described earlier. And I'll talk about the findings I'll present to you come from a study that I mentioned, an ARC-funded project called the Disability Inclusive City, where we looked at the experiences of people accessing mainstream services in 4 Australian cities. And we've interviewed staff in these services and the kinds of adjustments they were making to make the services more inclusive for people with intellectual disabilities specifically. And we talked to people with intellectual disability about their experiences of those places. And I should say here that we found places through the interviews with people with intellectual disabilities. So most of the places we got to, it's because a participant told us that that's one of their favorite places to go to. So we went out, and if someone said, well, I really like to go to the library, then we went out to the library and tried to understand what is it about the library that makes it more inclusive. And libraries came up quite a lot in a lot of our interviews, and that's how we come to have this presentation today. And I do want to acknowledge my colleagues, Chris Bigby, Brendan Gleeson, and Ellen Van Holstein, who are part of the research team and the thinking about that sort of underpins this presentation. So libraries have had a bad reputation. We tend to imagine our collective imagination that libraries are the place where you're closely monitored by a librarian, where you have to speak very quietly, you have to behave very strict, behave appropriately. It's a place with strict norms and they're closely enforced. And the primary function of library, as we imagine it, often it relates to literacy. And so on face value, it wouldn't seem as necessarily the place that would be inclusive for people with intellectual disability. If you have this sort of stereotypical understanding of libraries and probably also a stereotypical understanding of people with intellectual disabilities. But libraries have changed a lot. They've really transformed. And the 21st century public library is very different to that kind of imagination, which people still, I think, many people still carry in their minds. There's also a perception that public libraries are dying. And it is true in some countries like the UK I mentioned. I don't know if they're dying, but they're definitely contracting because of austerity. But in Australia, it's very far from the truth. And one librarian told us libraries are busier than ever. People are coming. They look and feel very different from those stereotypes that I've described. They're no longer just a place to read or borrow books. They're more like a community living room, a place where everyone is welcome. You can come in freely. You can have a free computer. You can use the internet for free. There's books there. There's magazines. They're all free to read. There'll be often a section with toys for the children. Overall, the library is a pretty noisy space, I would say a very happy space. That's the kind of atmosphere that I often experience in libraries. Unlike a commercial space where you have to pay to stay, then that's not a requirement in the public library. So the books are still there. It's still an important part of the library, but the library has become something much, much bigger than that. In our study, we discovered people with intellectual disability are increasingly using and visiting libraries. And I think it's partly because the NDIS provides people more individualized support. So they can use some of their one-on-one supports for community participation. And people might go to the library with a support worker. So I think that's one of the reasons. But I think people have just discovered the benefits that libraries provide. All those things I mentioned, access to computers and internet. And it's just a place where they can hang out, see other people, rest on a sofa, read a book, read a newspaper. You're out of home. It's outside of your home. You're in a public space, but you can feel at home in a library. Some of the participants with an intellectual disability in our study told us libraries were their favorite mainstream places to go to in the city. Darcy, for example, described the library as a lovely day. And I love how he spoke about it as a day, not a place, an experience. The lovely, nice people in the library, he's feeling that they wait inside for him. That's kind of idea that someone waits inside for you. I think that's a very powerful kind of way of expressing belonging. Not all participants shared that view. I would say that about half of the participants with intellectual disability did say that they never or rarely go to the library. And I don't know if that's because they had necessarily bad experiences or that they've never really tried or they're not really aware of what the library has to offer. Remember Doreen Massey's geometries of power and how different places kind of have different levels of connection to global flows of information and power. But the library is a place that connects you as a person to those global flows of information. That's where you can go into the internet for free. You can go through collections of books, of magazines from all over the world. I think public libraries in Australia do a great job connecting people through those kinds of networks. And many people with intellectual disabilities, like Jack and Miriam, who we interviewed, they have low incomes. And the library is one place where they can access the internet, read the news magazines that otherwise would cost quite a lot of money. So they can stay informed, see what's new, and it's all for free. And the fact that there's librarians there can help them with this technology, it makes it not only affordable, but also more accessible. But as I mentioned, library is more than just books and magazines or even internet access. It's a place, first and foremost. So when Rose, we asked you, what library, she said, any library, one that gets me out of the house. It's interesting thinking about belonging from that perspective, because home is the ultimate place of belonging. But for many people, it's not. It's just a house. And for many people with disabilities, specifically for Rose, I think the home wasn't a place of belonging, a group home. But the library was a place of belonging where she can get out of the house. As I mentioned earlier, the norm that's most stereotypically associated with libraries is the expectation to be quiet. You'll have seen dozens of cartoons like this one, parodies of the librarian shushing visitors in the library. And we have a quote here from a librarian who explained that libraries are still in this process of transformation. Many visitors, especially older ones, who have been using these libraries for decades, still expect the library to be this sort of quiet place to read books. And libraries are trying to continue to offer that experience for this particular cohort, while also opening up and creating other spaces and other atmospheres that are more inclusive towards other users and other uses. And that becomes quite an interesting tension. Even if the librarians are open to people being noisy, sometimes carers come in with a person with intellectual disability and tell them to be quiet. So it comes from the carers rather than the librarians, as you can see that in the quotes. So I guess the carers still carry in their minds that kind of norm of the traditional library being a place that you have to be quiet. not quite being fully aware that the norms are actually changing. For some of the people that we've interviewed with an intellectual disability, the quiet atmosphere in the library, it was a sense of comfort though. We asked Ella, one of the participants, what she likes about libraries, and that's what she said, exactly that, a quiet place. I think she thinks about quiet, that's my interpretation of it at least, that for her, a quiet place is not necessarily about noise levels, it's more about a sense of being quiet, relaxed, a sense of spaciousness, a space that she can linger in. So I think quiet can be interpreted in different ways. But, you know, as I mentioned, many libraries can be quite noisy places today, full of children playing, adults chatting, various activities happening. But it's still a quiet place in other ways in terms of the atmosphere. In one library we looked at in Ivanhoe, they've decided the existing design of the building, the materiality of the building doesn't really cater very well for neither those who want quiet nor those who want to do noisy stuff. It just didn't work for either of them because noise from the quiet or noise from the noisy areas would still flow into the quiet areas and they couldn't really separate it. So they've redesigned the library and they got a lot of funding from the state government and from the council to rebuild their library, which tells you something also about the flourishing of libraries. There is funding for this today. So they wanted to make the library, I guess, more modern, more accessible, and to be able to separate different sections in the library. And I guess reflecting the transformation of the function of libraries. But it's interesting, I think it's great that libraries are kind of also changing their physical design, but it's interesting, it has implications in terms of attachments, because people do get attached to those old places, those old materialities, they have memories, and when you redesign a whole new library, some of those memories are lost too. Not suggesting that that's a bad decision, but it's always comes with a price as well. I don't know if any of you here on Zoom ever borrowed a library book, failed to return it on time, then you had a late fee penalty, and then you never came back to that library to avoid paying that fee. Maybe that's just me. But libraries have changed, as I said, and they've now removed in most libraries in Australia, I don't know if most, but many libraries in Australia have removed fines for late book returns to make it more affordable for people with lower incomes, including people with intellectual disability. So if you think about the kind of neoliberal city, public places are progressively being replaced with private spaces for consumption where you have to pay money to stay and you have to buy stuff if you want to stay. The libraries are still different, and even more so. They're kind of outside of that norm of consumption. They're free for all. You're invited to stay. Books are there not as commodities to consume, but as commons to share. And we did learn in our research that, you know, they have been thinking specifically about people with intellectual disabilities when removing the fines. They were thinking about the difficulty people with intellectual disabilities were having sometimes to return a book in time. So that was one of the drivers for libraries to remove late book return fees. In other places of consumptions, you're only welcome to stay if you buy stuff, but here you can stay as long as you wish. And there's like materialities in place, like you can see there's little sofas and places to sit and stay. They really invite you to linger, to stay, which makes it a very inviting place, very welcoming and inclusive space. That said, that sense of welcome to stay and to linger wasn't shared by all of our participants. Some, like Sue quoted on this slide, said that they would come into the library, spend a few minutes there, and then leave. And we've heard something similar from other librarians in other places who noticed some visitors with intellectual disability coming in, looking around, and just walking out again. So I guess on the plus side, it would show that the library is an open space, which is welcome to people for people to enter or leave at will. But it does suggest that although libraries are becoming more inclusive, maybe they're still not inviting enough for people to keep them more than a few minutes there, to give everyone that sense that they are welcome to stay. Importantly, I think library staff, they're playing a really important role these days as providing support for people. For any library users, they provide support, for example, to use the computers, to use, to find the books that you need. That's a really important role that makes libraries so inclusive for people with intellectual disability. But there are all kinds of things that, we can't really expect librarians to do in terms of the kinds of skills and knowledge that we might expect disability support workers to have, but we can't really expect librarians to have those skills. Just one example that came up in our study was a librarian saying how a person came to them asking help from the librarian to apply for a payday loan. And the librarian didn't want to help them because the librarian was aware of the risk of applying for a payday loan and the high interest. But the librarian didn't quite know what to do. And I don't know if a lot of specialist disability support workers would actually know what to do. But, if you kind of think about supported decision-making and how to work through issues like risk and decision-making, these are quite specialist support practices that we can't really expect librarians to have. So this is quite interesting in terms of how much support should be provided by mainstream providers like the library itself, and how much do people still need to come with their own specialist support. Libraries are places of encounter between people from diverse social and cultural backgrounds because they're such welcoming places where people from all walks of life come to the library and feel safe and welcome to enter and stay. And if in the past, the conversation wasn't really encouraged, it was actually discouraged. Now it's really encouraged through activities, organized activities like classes, reading groups, workshops. So that promotes interaction and sort of active encounter between different visitors from very different walks of life. So that creates an opportunity for people with disability and intellectual disability to encounter new people, to experience, I guess, conviviality. That said, one of the things that does happen in libraries, and that's common in other mainstream services too, is that there is still a tendency to run separate activities for people with intellectual disability because their needs are perceived to be very different. So that allows, I guess, more tailored activities that meet people's needs, but it does limit opportunities for encounter. This kind of separation of activities was a recurring theme in many of our interviews. But one that stood out for me was in relation to libraries was that this librarian that spoke about the concern of parents of children when an adult with intellectual disability tried to join a library story time for children. For the adult with intellectual disability, this activity might have really been suitable for their literacy level or interests. And we've heard from several participants who told us they often go to the children book section. That's the section they love in the library. But for the children's parents, the presence of an adult with intellectual disability or an adult in general in a children's story time was sometimes confronting. And the library seemed to take that parent side and exclude people with disability from those types of activities. So there's some interesting tensions. And I think what it does show is libraries are very inclusive spaces. I do really think it's one of the most inclusive spaces that we have in cities today. But there are still elements of exclusion in libraries, which kind of brings me to my conclusion to close this presentation. I guess we can see that there's a new generation of public libraries that's more inclusive for many people with disabilities, but not for everyone. As I said, about half our participants hardly or never go to the library. And this is the kind of inclusion, but also exclusion in libraries shaped by this sort of complex, I guess, intersection of materialities, atmospheres, norms, institutions, encounters, attachments, all those elements of place. So what does this mean for us, I guess, if we think about people with disability and our allies? What's our challenge? I think one of our challenges is to find those kinds of places, those existing places like libraries, so that we can utilize them and use them so that people with intellectual disability will find those spaces of belonging and inclusion in the city. And we can create new spaces like that once we know what it looks like, what an inclusive place looks like. But I want to go a bit beyond just to say, oh, we need, to make adjustments. This sort of transformation in libraries, this transformation that libraries have gone through in recent decades. To me, it's really inspiring to move beyond that sort of idea of marginal adjustments, to think about how we can more radically reimagine how different mainstream places in the city can become something quite different, in the same way that libraries are really different from what they were 30 years ago. And that, to me, is a bigger challenge. So I'll finish here and very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Ilan. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure most of the audience found it really interesting too. Okay, so our second speaker this afternoon is Charity Sims-Jenkins, who's a PhD candidate at the Living with Disability Research Centre here at La Trobe, and Charity is also a social work graduate and an experienced supporter of a self-advocacy group up in the country. So Charity is going to talk about part of her PhD, which is the influence of stories on disability support staff support for choice and control. So over to you, Charity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm in the same place as Chris today on the Bandura campus, so in the land of Wurundjeri people. So I'm just going to add to my respect as well to traditional owners and to elders past, present and emerging. And I'll get my mouse working. How's this? Okay. So I'm going to talk today about the rationale, design and preliminary results of a workshop we've done for disability support staff, which aim to improve their support for choice and control with adults with intellectual disabilities. That's parts 1, 2 and 3 I'll go through. So part 1 is the rationale. So I'm just going to go through a short overview of the theory and literature behind the workshop. So the need for choice and control. So the underlying principle behind the workshop was that choice and control is so important, and yet that adults with intellectual disabilities don't always have access to it as much as everyone else. So self-determination, when talking about individuals, is acting based on one's own choices and intrinsic motivations. So those are motivations that come from within ourselves, not from outside ourselves. And self-determination theory tells us that acting based on these internal motivations is a psychological need. And that's why it's so important that people with intellectual disabilities have self-determination just like everyone else. So I'm using the term choice and control instead of self-determination throughout this presentation, just because it's a more familiar term with the NDIS. So self-determination, seeing it as the same as having choice and being in control of your own life, having that control so you can follow your intrinsic motivations. So the next piece leading up to the workshop was the idea of how to influence staff to provide better support for choice and control. And I was looking for an evidence-based theoretical solution. And I looked into discrimination because I realised that, well, if supporters aren't supporting choice, it must be a type of discrimination, because what discrimination is an action of harm based on thoughts and feelings, and it's reducing choice, which is harmful because that's a psychological need. So I looked into attitude change theories and found that the ordinary theories about discrimination weren't applying to what's happening in support for adults with intellectual disabilities. So yes, it's causing harm to deny choice and control, but it was a different pathway happening, not the same as the ordinary one, which is the ordinary pathway is negative stereotypes leading to contemptuous feelings like prejudice, and then to deliberately harmful actions, which is discrimination. So it wasn't that, it's more staff withholding options from people because they don't want them to choose the ones that will be harmful, and reducing the person's control based on a desire to help and not harm, so actually to avoid harm. And I found a theory in the literature that seemed to fit better. The stereotype content model had this concept, benevolent discrimination. So that's a different pathway based on a mix of stereotypes, positive and negative thoughts and feelings, thinking people with intellectual disabilities are friendly and feeling positive and warm toward them, at the same time as thinking they're not competent, and so not feeling as much respect, which leads to actions that are meaning well but withholding options. So that's benevolent discrimination. And now the point of knowing the type of discrimination is to know what kind of interventions will address it. That's what I was going for. And I needed to make the distinction from ordinary types of discrimination, because the intervention for them that works is to encourage the participants, the discriminatory group, to feel warmth and liking toward the target group by putting them into contact with each other and showing them how wonderful they really are, so their actions to them won't be hostile anymore. But the reason that's not as likely to work for benevolent discrimination is because, as part of the definition, that warmth is already there. So looking in the literature for something that works for benevolent discrimination, there's not much there yet, but what is looking promising is the idea of getting the participants their existing feelings of warmth and liking for the target group, and building on these, redirecting how they're being acted upon by showing them which actions are causing harm. Because we know that they're not wanting to cause harm. And in terms of the workshop, that means the idea is, if disability support staff hear about the harms of not having choice and control and hear examples of how this is happening with support, will their existing warmth redirect them into understanding and intending to provide better support for choice and control? So that's the idea that's led to these research questions and propositions. So my first research question is, how do staff perceive adults with intellectual disabilities? And my proposition, what I think it might be, is that they perceive them with paternalistic stereotypes of seeing them as warm and friendly but not competent, and with paternalistic prejudice, which is feeling care and liking but holding them in low esteem. And I'll just note that I wasn't 100% thinking this is exactly what I'm going to find and this is what people are thinking and feeling, but it was what's matching with the stereotype content model, so that's what I'm looking for to compare against. My second question is, how do staff in disability services understand and intend to support self-determination for adults with intellectual disabilities? And I should have said choice and control, actually, sorry. So proposition is benevolent discrimination, intending to provide the best support but using their own values instead of the values of people being supported. And final question, do these understandings and perceptions change after an intervention based on the stereotype content model? And my proposition is that, well, I'm hoping so, yes. So part two, what the workshop was, we did a 2-hour workshop for disability staff using stories by adults with intellectual disabilities about how they feel when they're not well supported with choice and control. And the image on the right is from one of the flyers from the workshop. We use the title, Supporting Choice and Control, See the Whole Person, Tune into Their Feelings. The first step in developing the workshop was I had interviews with a handful of self-advocates about their experiences of how they've been supported by staff with choice and control, and looking for those times when they didn't feel happy with the support that they had to make their own choices or be in control. And in the interviews with these people with intellectual disabilities, I went back and forward talking to them and trying to tease out what they had to say. And then I later went back and listened to those interviews and rearranged it into a narrative to make it sound like a story, which I then took back to the person and we went over it together to each person and just verified that it did represent their feelings and was their story. So in preparing the workshop, I worked with 2 self-advocates, the ones pictured here, Rachel and Catherine, and we formed a working group to work on the content of the workshop, and we were supported also by my supervisors, Chris and Tal. And yeah, we developed the content for delivering to disability support staff. We built it around the stories that I've brought in, and we decided to have them filmed and read out by actors with intellectual disabilities. And this was, the idea behind using actors was that they would be best able to deliver the emotion, which was really central to what we're trying to do. And it would always be the right delivery if it's on video. So we delivered the workshop. We did 12 different times that we did it, and overall there were 62 participants who were a mix of disability support staff and students of disability support courses. So we included students to capture more people, but overall I'm just going to be talking about staff and usually including those students. We did some of the courses, some of the workshops were online and some were in person, so different places. And they were built around the stories, but we had some key messages that we were saying along the way that we worked on together. And a key one was that it feels bad if you don't have choice and control over your life because it's a human need with a theory behind that. And some other messages we worked on together and tried to get across were that when you're supporting a person, think about how they experience a situation from their point of view. How do they feel about the choices they have? How do they feel about how they're being supported? And to be able to do this, you need to see the whole person and tune into their feelings. So when we were showing the videos, which are the main part, we asked, we had instructions for the workshop participants. We said, and there were 5 video stories. We said, for each story, consider the situation as it's experienced by the person telling the story from their point of view. How are they feeling about how they're being supported? And we asked them to consider 3 questions and then answer them after each video. And the answers that they gave, we put up on a word cloud because people, participants were entering them into an app on their phone, so they would all show up. And I'm going to give you a feel for what was in the workshop by showing you one of the videos. So I'm going to ask you while you're watching it to keep these instructions and these questions in mind, and then I'll show you an example of how staff answered the questions. So the 3 questions are, how does the person feel about how they're being supported? Which responses from staff in the story are making the person feel this way? And what were the staff intending to do? Okay, so the story I'm going to show you is called Jamie's story, but Jamie's not the real name. We changed any identifying details from the story for confidentiality. And this one's acted by Fiona McKenzie.
Jamie's story. Hi, I'm Jamie. I live in shared accommodation. I haven't always lived here. I used to have my own house with a really good veranda. One day, I was told to move out because I needed it for something else. And now, I'm not happy here. It's getting worse. I hear people outside my room when I'm trying to sleep. People knock at my door late at night and they ask for smokes. And I even hear people screaming. They don't want to be here. I have a big fan on to stop the noise. It's too much. Sometimes I need to scream too. So I go to my room and scream it out. I can't relax. I have trouble sleeping. I'm so tired. I get headaches all the time. I do dream of having my own place again with a beautiful veranda. So a while ago, I asked about leaving. One of the staff members says I can't move out. My family think that too. Everyone says I'm safer here. Yeah, I'm starting to think that. So I guess I am safer here than on my own. I know I have to stay here. But there's something I don't get. everything's supposed to have changed with the NDIS. I get told it's up to me now. People try to tell me that I can do what I want. They tell me I can cook, I can go out, I can go swimming. And I do. I do those things. But something doesn't add up. If everything's up to me now, then where I live is up to me. But how do I make a choice of where to live?
Okay, so now next I'm going to show you the word cloud, what staff said, participants in the workshop said in response. But note that there were 5 videos in total in the workshop, and we collected through the word cloud the answers for all of the videos combined in the end. So there'll be different answers that are from other videos too. And the first question that we'd ask is, how does the person feel about how they're being supported? And you know, the more people type something in, the more it would show up. So the common responses was confused, and this was especially coming up for Jamie's story, not listened to, disrespected, anxious, unhappy, frustrated. That's how she's feeling. Second question, which responses from staff are making the person feel this way? And we say the person instead of her name because it kept coming up for everyone. So people said that staff were not giving choice, inconsiderate to needs, creating fear, protecting, controlling, not giving options, not listening, not giving an explanation. And the third question, what were the staff intending to do? And the idea behind this question was to understand that the harm's not always intentional, although it can be. So this example group from this workshop said, control the situation, that staff are intending to overprotect, control the client, keep them safe, stop distraction, mostly for another example, I think, avoid unknown new issues, and remove choice. And a fourth question was added after a few videos had been shown. And it was, what are these stories telling us after you've got an overall view about how to support people with their choice and control? And the aim here was to give the participants a space to find for themselves based on what they're seeing, to let the videos do the work of showing what's harmful rather than giving instructions. And this group said that what it is important to do is give them choice, ask how they feel, communicate, be person-centered, talk through concerns, ask open questions, respect, looking at all options. So this is things that participants in the workshops are putting in for themselves at the time, but to really understand what was changing for them, if anything, I needed more detail, and so I interviewed as many of the workshop participants as I could. My data collection is that I managed to speak to 22 workshop participants who were disability service staff or students of disability support courses, and I made it a criteria that the people I spoke to would have experience of direct support with people with intellectual disabilities or similar, so that it was as close to interviewed staff as possible of disability support services. The aim of the interviews was to answer the research questions, and my approach was a qualitative, semi-structured interview format using vignette scenarios, which were example stories about people with intellectual disabilities in different situations, and asking the participants what they would do to support this person. And then exploring how they were understanding and intending to support choice and control. And I'm doing my analysis now in different layers, a bit of deductive and inductive. Deductive in that I'm bringing in concepts from the stereotype content model that I've shown, the perceptions of warmth and competence, but I'm also using a more inductive approach to look for things like how staff are thinking about support, which I don't have prior descriptors for, and I'm looking for the data to tell me. So just these are scenarios we did in the interviews. In each interview, I would ask 2 scenarios. They had different types. There was one that was risk related and one without risk, but where maybe there's some assumptions that would be made. So in the first interview, this is just a short summary of each one. I asked about John, who likes trains and wants to be a train driver as a job, and about Nancy, who wants access to more of her money for going out drinking with friends. So that was the one with the potential risk. And in the second interview, I asked people about Michelle, who, when her support worker asked what she wants to do, she always says she wants to go to the shops. And Carl, who met a man online a few weeks ago and wants to go interstate to meet him because he's falling in love. So up to my preliminary results, the part 3, looking for what changed for staff and students who attended the workshop. And these are preliminary results because I'm still going through all this, and what I've found so far that I'm presenting today, it might evolve later as I go through it in more depth and understand it better. So my first research question, how do staff perceive adults with intellectual disabilities? Now, remembering the propositions I have, that there'd be a mix of feeling positive and warm, as well as seeing people as having low competence, and that's the combination that leads to benevolent discrimination. So looking at the warm feelings, warm thoughts and feelings, there was consistently positive perceptions from the participants of people with intellectual disabilities or of providing support. Basically, consistently that helping is what motivates staff to do their jobs, which is great. In terms of competence and esteem that I was looking for, it was trickier. Found that the participants were reluctant to acknowledge differences in terms of deficits, and definitely avoiding making negative stereotypes, especially if they felt like I was asking for stereotypes, which I kind of was, and not wanting to stereotype about competence. So they would say things like, oh, well, everyone's so different. I couldn't say any one thing about them or their support needs because everyone's just so different, when I was asking directly about that. But then in the answers to the scenarios, there's also responses that show maybe unstated support needs, such as people are breaking complex things down into steps. So I found this as complex and I'm still looking at it, but I am seeing an aim not to be prejudiced. And that's enough, I think, here that I know that the warmth is there, which is the crux of the theory, and the desire not to be prejudiced also fits in with that as well. So this might work from a theoretical perspective with what I have here. Second question is, how do staff understand and intend to support choice and control? I'm looking for that benevolent discrimination, actions of active helping and unintentional harm. And this is where I'm using the more inductive analysis, because I'm looking for markers of this benevolent discrimination, but I'm not sure what actions or patterns are going to consistently indicate it in what people are saying in a way that I can compare it across the before and after interviews. So are there sets of actions that can highlight as always indicating good support for choice and control, or not? And my initial thoughts as I'm coding is that, oh, well, getting to know the person well is something I'm seeing in the data. This will be an indicator of good support because we know it's a necessary part of good support for choice and control. But I was surprised to find that it's not so straightforward. So I've got some different examples here of what can happen with gathering that information and understanding the person to know them better. And the first example is that you can gather information about the person to support them to get what they want. And I'm just going to use a quote to show an example of each of these. So the first quote is, I guess I'd start with Michelle. What is it that you like doing when you go shopping? What is it? Start to ask questions to help understand what it is she's getting out of that. And the next one, you can use the gathering info to provide alternative options for their preference. So something they might prefer to their current choice or direction. Quote for this is, then I probably could ask more broader life questions like, do you have any friends? Is there anyone you want to get to know better? Maybe there's a budding relationship at work we don't know about that we could be supporting. Does she have any goals that we're not aware of? So in this case, Michelle's saying she wants to go shopping, but this participant's asking, perhaps finding out about her other goals, it'll turn out there's something else she'd prefer that she hasn't said. Another one is that you can do with the information is provide alternative options for external constraints. So this quote is helping her explore the options and being realistic about the pros and cons, what is and isn't possible. She might be going to swimming twice a week and she might be prepared to give up the swimming so she can go out with her friends and have a drink more often. And another way you might use the information to provide alternative options is because of the person's capabilities. So the quote is, he might not have capacity to be a train driver, but he might really think that's what he wants to do. So you'd have to think about creative supports and how you might be able to come up with something in the middle that works, whether it be linking into a volunteer thing where he could be with the volunteer train driver or something else. And just another one, you can use the information of knowing the person well to persuade the person away from their choice. If you see them going in a direction that you think is risky or unhealthy, steering them towards different options. So this quote is, what is it she likes about the bars and clubs? Is it the loud noise, the environment? Is it socializing with people? What input is she enjoying from that? And are there other environments that could do that as well with similar sensory input, but a different activity that might take the focus more off drinking? And so I've gone through a few examples here, and to me, they're not equal when it comes to supporting choice and control, because I'd argue here with persuading someone away from their choice, it is trying to direct them in a way which is taking some of the control onto yourself by limiting or just highlighting the options that are being presented. In which case, I'm seeing that gathering information to understand the person isn't the indicator of good support I'd expected. It's necessary for supporting choice and control, but not necessarily sufficient, because it matters what you do with the information. But then these follow-up actions I've just described, I'm not seeing them yet as indicators either, supporting the choice and offering alternatives and persuading. Because say in this case of persuasion, there is a lack of acceptance of the person's ultimate goal. But even in the ones where there was an acceptance of it, I could still sometimes see an application of control in different places. So I'm asking, what makes an action more or less supportive of someone's choice and control? And I'm just going to, I'm thinking it might have something to do with how the support person interprets what it means to have choice and control. So I'm going to take you through these two examples of someone who is supporting Carl with his choice to meet Paul. So example one, the quote. So for Carl, relationships are obviously important to him. We've got to be mindful that we're supportive, but not limit his options on the grounds of safety and all those sorts of things. So traveling interstate, does he want to do that independently? Does he want to have a support worker go with him, or how can that be facilitated? His preferred form of travel, does he want to go in a car, on the train, on a bus, or does he want to fly? So this is someone who's supporting Carl, as I see it, at least with his process of how he's going to meet Paul. And then this example is a bit different. Someone's still supporting Carl with his choice to meet Paul, but the quote is, that's not to say you couldn't help plan a trip, but maybe rather than planning a trip for next week, I'd be more inclined to encourage a trip for 3 months' time and then see how their relationship goes. If they're still talking when you get to that 3 months, they really got to know each other, and then you can go on a trip. And just have one part of that trip being meeting Paul, maybe not focus the entire trip on him. So this person's supporting Carl with his end goal of meeting Paul, but maybe making some decisions on the way about how it's done. And I'm seeing the difference between these as seeming to be based on a different interpretation of what it means for the person with intellectual disability to have choice and control. Because they're both aiming to support the person to have their choice, but they're seeing differently what that means. So the first one is supporting Carl to navigate the processes of his life towards his goals, and for Carl to choose how much of it he's doing it for himself. So not just where does he want to get to, but how does he want to get there? And the second one is getting Carl to the end goal that he wants to meet Paul, but defining the goal and getting to it, but seeing that as a single point decision to get something and getting there, however it happens. And then I'm going to add a third way that I think might be a bit different again. So this is an example of, and it's from a different scenario. It's one, someone speaking about supporting Nancy to get her choice of getting more money. This person said, what do we need to do to get Nancy to have more control over her funds? Does she need to learn more about budgeting, about banking and all that sort of stuff, making shopping lists, savings? If she was able to learn those skills and able to understand them, then there really shouldn't be an issue of why she's not in control of her funding. So this person's aiming to build Nancy's capacity. And I'm adding that now as a middle option that maybe fits between the other two, middle way of thinking about choice and control, is that the person to have choice and control means doing as much for yourself as possible and just being supported to fill in the gaps. And that leads me to, like, I made this table of, okay, start with thinking about choice and control one way and what it means. It'll lead to different ways of providing support. So first one I've got is if you're thinking of choice and control as getting to end goals, then your support might look like promoting the process that's safest or best for the person's interest and setting out those steps for them to take, or teaching them skills, or taking the steps for them, just doing whatever works, because the priority is seen as getting to that end point of supporting the choice. Or if you see having choice and control as having capacity or building capacity, then providing support would look like providing information and resources, including information about safety, what the person needs to know, around the multiple paths that they might want to take, but prioritizing the resources and information according to the abilities they have or don't have, need filled in. So there's teaching the person skills to take the steps for themselves with a and just filling in the gaps according to where their abilities aren't getting them there. And the third one, navigating a process. If you see choice and control as navigating a process, then your support might be providing information and resources, including safety, so written very similar to the previous one, around the multiple paths a person may take, but prioritizing these according to their preferences for how they want to navigate where they're going. So that means checking how much support the person wants along the way and how much control they want to take, and do they want to build skills or not. They may want to at some points or not, so it's not necessarily the focus. They may want to be stepped through this part and not that, and this will evolve as they're going along. Then what I find interesting in this, thinking that ways of thinking about it would lead to different types of support, is that if you are thinking of choice and control as getting to end goals, that first one, getting from A to B, then the response to that is supporting choice and control. But if you're seeing it as that navigating of processes, then that first one isn't necessarily supporting choice and control, because it's taking over that process, which is seen as part of having choice and control. And that's so the reason I chose Jamie's story to show as a video in particular is because I think the feelings coming across from her in that story were not just about whether she was getting what she wanted, which is to live somewhere else, but the feeling of confusion and lack of control from not feeling like she's in control of it all, and wanting to know her options, not thinking she does know them, so she can navigate them. And I was hoping or thinking that when showing this video to people, that this feeling of hers would come across through the video and influence staff way of thinking about how to support her in that situation, knowing that how she's feeling about not being in control, sorry. This leads to my third research question. Do the perceptions of the workshop participants change after the workshop? So yeah, have the staff and the students who attended changed what they think about what it means to have choice and control in the way I've just described. I'm not sure about that yet. I'm still exploring that. But I can say that the participants got the message that it feels bad not to be supported with choice and control, and that everyone was mostly motivated by hearing the video stories, that they want to reduce the harm felt by the person in them about not having choice and control. So, and things that people said in interviews that they intend to change about how they work is they want to be more critical, check how their actions are being received, and use non-judgmental language and a lot of things like that, putting checks in place to remind them of things. So yeah, something is getting across. But in terms of the types of thinking about choice and control that I was just describing, leading to different types of support, I'm not seeing anything obvious about that change yet. And there may be something more subtle as I dig deeper. But either way, the good news is that this analysis I've been doing is uncovering a lot about how disability support staff are thinking about what it means to have choice and control and its relationship to support. And that is very interesting, could lead to new things. So whether or not the workshop changes this type of thinking, I could get some clues as to why it does or doesn't, or something else. And that's where I'm at. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charity. That was really, really well presented. Thank you. Thank you very much again, Charity. That was a great presentation. Well done. And as Charity mentioned, she's going to be presenting at the ACID conference, which is on the 22nd to the 24th of November in real live face-to-face time in Melbourne. And Ilan too will be a keynote speaker at that conference, and the early bird registration is still available. So if you're interested in coming to the ACID conference in November, then please go to the ACID conference website, which you'll be able to find through Google, and have a look at the program and think about registering. Or if you're an organisation, you could think about sponsoring too. That was a piece of free advertising for ACID. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this afternoon. The slides and the recordings will be available on our website in a week or so. And our next seminar will be the 11th of October. And this will be the launch of a set of evidence-based resources on quality hospital care for people with intellectual disabilities. So Teresa Icono from LIDS has been leading a translation project to develop a set of evidence-based resources which are targeted at family members, hospital staff, and disability service staff in separate streams to look at how to adjust and support people with intellectual disabilities through the hospital journey and to get the best possible care and treatment for people during that process. And she's going to present the finalised resources and some of the evaluation work on them, but we'll start with looking at the research that underpinned those resources that was done a few years ago and funded through what was then called the Disability Research Agenda. So it's sort of starting from the beginning of the research and then talking about how it was translated, how it was developed into training materials, and then how they've been evaluated. And then you'll be able to access them from that date. So please come along on the 11th of October, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much for coming this afternoon. Okay, bye-bye.